it must begin, I think, at this grassroots to resist the entrapments, really, of these higher levels of government. Because when they give you money, there's all these tentacles attached, you know? I think that's what we have to do to make local government more transparent, too, to the people, accountable. And really, local officials, I think, at the end of the day, are easily held more accountable. It's good to hear you guys talk about this, and I know you have in many different venues, Marshall, and the benefits of decentralization, right?
Well, exactly, and this all comes back down to biblical wisdom. What we're talking about here is not just an idea or a theory that has not been tried and tested. It is the absolute Word of God that tells us so clearly. In Samuel chapter 8, for example, the children of Israel were tired of being governed by God. They were tired of trusting God and His Word and having all this self-government. At that point, they were the richest people in the world. Can you imagine a group of strangers coming out of bondage come into the promised land, and over the period of the next 100 years or so, become richer than Egypt, richer than Babylonia, that had been around for thousands of years trying to become rich, and these people became the richest in the world. How did they do it? They did it by following these basic biblical simple principles of free enterprise, private property, local government, trusting God rather than trusting man. And what happened is they finally got tired of that because they looked around at the kings and they were so pompous. And so they said, can't we want a king to be like all the other people? And God said to them, yes, you want a king. Samuel, the prophet, came back to him and the judge and said, oh, they don't love me anymore. And God says, no, Samuel, they've not rejected you, they've rejected me. So let them have a king. But when they have a king, he will take the tenth. He'll take the fruit of their labors. He'll take the very essence and the best of their seed. He will take their sons and run them off to war in front of his chariots, and he'll take their daughters and work them in his state-run soup kitchen. That's what it says, in essence. And so, what is it saying there? It's saying if you want to not trust God, then you are going to have one other alternative, and that is the king or the leader or the big government will tell you where to work. It'll tell you when you go to war, when you die, when you wake up, and when you go to bed. And that's what happens in every nation in the history of the world, guys. That's why history is so important. To know this history is to know that the only other alternative, which by God's grace was used by our Pilgrim Fathers and was confirmed by our founding fathers in the Constitution, was Christian self-government. We would rule ourselves under God's rule and love Him and trust Him to meet our needs. And then we would work with others who were having trouble so that when they're in need, we would help them. And then we would help each other, educate our children, and we'd help each other, and we'd be involved as a team of believers to do this. That's the way society was built. And there was freedom and justice for all. And the government was off our backs. And for the first 350 years of America, you hardly knew the name of the president or even a colonial leader. Most people just simply knew what was going on in their local communities because that's where the decisions were made. It can happen again, and I believe it will.
Absolutely. And Marshall, there's a Bible verse that says a man is to be paid for his wages basically at the end of the day. And that principle is that man is never enslaved to anything, if you think about it. He collects his wages, he goes his way, and if he chooses to work the next day, that's his choice. If he chooses not to work, it's also his choice not to have wages to buy food. That kind of freedom goes right back to the principles of the Hebrew Republic. Each family had its own land. It was responsible to till and work that land. It was responsible to deal civilly with its neighbors. We have what's called fence laws where we live. If I put up a fence, my neighbor and I have certain responsibilities on each half of the fence, if you want to call it that, the right half and the left half. These principles go way back to when you had your land. You had to till and raise the produce from your land, and that's how you made your money. You could choose not to till your land, but it'd be a pretty hungry year next year. But that's your responsibility and freedom to do that. As we've kind of backed off of those principles, we start to want to make sure we have food on our table, but someone else gets to do it for us, whether it be the government giving us a freebie or somehow we rely on our neighbor to do that for us. And that, of course, was not how things were set up. There's supposed to be individual responsibilities, family responsibilities, church responsibilities, and frankly, that's where most of government, if you want to look at it, is to reside. Government actually should get smaller as it moves up the mountain, if you want to use that diagram. When you finally get to the federal government, it should be very, very small, and the local government, which is really constituted of families, church, and some local civil government, is actually your biggest part of your government right there. So the decisions can be made locally. Can you imagine how school boards would look if it was really run as a group of families getting together at the local town hall and saying, okay, this is what education is going to look like this year? Changes everything. You don't have arguments with teachers' unions. You just don't have that. What you have is families together working together to educate the next generation on the values that are important to them. And that may be different in different areas of the country, and that's okay. We do not have to indoctrinate everybody in the country to think exactly the same way. I don't know where that came from. And that's really wrong, and that's why I love home education, because, frankly, the parents become responsible for having educated their children. They can't blame anybody but themselves if it's not done.
Well, yeah, exactly. You know, this point of local government to have a clear and open public record of events and to get the word out to as many people as possible and about government and make it accessible and understandable to as many people as possible that live in the area. I mean, eventually that information will lead to the election of board members and judges and sheriffs and assessors, even collectors, who better represent a greater percentage of the population, if the information's out there, and better represent the local values, like you said, Dan. It'll increase accountability, it'll help end corruption,